short list of different kinds of zones that already exist in the marine environment. So, many cases we hear that you can't possibly zone the ocean because of the dynamic nature of the ocean, et cetera, but in fact we do it already. The trouble is we do it without any kind of real integrated planning. So these zones are allocated, often conflicting with one another, and the result is something we don't like. Marine spatial planning is in fact an integrating kind of idea. You still carry out sector by sector management. You still issue permits on a sectoral basis, but suddenly now you have a guide to where things should be located or where things should not be located. And that's basically, that analysis and allocation process is what marine spatial planning is about. If you want a very simple analogy, it's exactly what we do on land. We prepare comprehensive plans for regions. We prepare comprehensive plans for cities. These comprehensive plans are often not regulatory. They're basically just a vision of where and how the region might develop. And usually, the regulatory aspect of comprehensive planning is zoning. We have zoning maps, we have zoning regulations in cities, and they prescribe in detail and through a regulatory approach where the activities are actually going to take place. So that's the difference between planning and zoning. I want to say a little bit about why space and time is important, because this is a very critical idea. Both Steve and John have said that in the past people have perceived the ocean basically as a limitless resource or a limitless space. You look out and see a flat surface of the ocean. Certainly, maybe not all of us because we understand what's going on underneath the ocean, but the person on the street looks out there and says, what's the problem? Why are we even worried about these kinds of things? So why is space and time important? There's a reality, and that is that the oceans are not homogeneous. Some areas are more important than others. There are some that are ecologically more important. And they include things like areas of high biodiversity, spawning areas, nursery areas, etc. We know a great deal about where those areas are for many animals. There are migration corridors. Some areas are economically more important than others. You can't build offshore renewable resources, particularly wind farms, if there's no wind, or at least sustained winds. You can't drill for oil and gas if there aren't oil and gas deposits in certain places. So some areas, and again, we know those areas perhaps even better than the biological and ecological areas, can be mapped in time and space. And if we're going to effectively manage these areas, we have to, again, understand the fact that some areas are more important than others, and we have to manage them to address this kind of spatial and temporal heterogeneity in the ocean. Now, what are the benefits of doing this? And I'm going to just quickly look at a couple of the benefits in different kinds of categories. And perhaps the most important one that we haven't done a very good job of actually explaining to industry and private interests is there are, in fact, economic benefits to marine spatial planning. That industry should support, and they should be real advocates for doing this. That's not always the case. But I just want to take a couple of these to illustrate why they're important. Industry likes certainty. You don't want to invest millions or billions of dollars in infrastructure over a 20 or 30 year period unless you know you're going to be able to carry out that activity over that period of time. You're not going to want to prepare plans or permit applications unless you are relatively certain that you're going to get the permit at the end of the day. So if we have a process that identifies compatible and incompatible uses, and you're applying for a permit in a particular area that says that this use is compatible with other uses and with nature in that area, you're likely to get the permit. Then you'll move ahead and you might get it fairly quickly. A very important part of planning is you want to be able to resolve conflicts between uses and between uses of human activities and the environment at the planning stage rather than react to these kinds of things, which is typically what we do today, during the individual project review. And again, if we had these kinds of this process in place, chances are pretty likely that we would be able to demonstrate to industry that they could streamline the permitting process. It wouldn't take years and years to get permits. We could probably do that in a fairly fast time that would benefit, again, the private sector if we had plans that said that this area was a good place to develop, this area was not a good place to develop. There are certainly environmental benefits. We want to be able to identify important biological and ecological areas, again, during the planning process. We want to be able to identify very quickly where there are going to be places that are likely going to conflict between human activities and nature. There are administrative benefits to government, certainly. We could improve the consistency and compatibility of individual regulatory decisions if we had marine spatial planning. We could improve the accountability of decision making, again, if we could see some of the effects in time and space rather than in an abstract sense that we do today. And we want to be able to reduce duplication of effort when it comes to data collection and other kinds of activities that we carry out normally, again, on a sector-by-sector basis. We don't have to collect the same data in each agency if we had a capability to look across these kinds of issues in a common database. And there are social benefits as well, in terms of increased community participation, ownership of planning, the identification of decisions on the allocation of different uses in the ocean on communities back on shore. For example, if we had a good activity, or a good map of fishing activities in the marine environment, and we knew who was using those particular spaces offshore, if we had a proposal to close fisheries or to establish a marine protected area, we would quickly know what communities would be affected by that kind of a decision. So, how do we actually carry this out? I always hesitate to use jokes in international meetings because sometimes jokes don't translate, but I hope you can understand this one, where if you're a mosquito in a nudist colony, you know what you're supposed to do. You just don't know where to begin. And one of the reasons that we decided to develop a guide to marine spatial planning is that many people came to us and said, this sounds like a great idea, but I don't not only know what it is, I don't know how to begin the kind of process. So I just want to begin with just a few slides in terms of what does marine spatial planning really mean, and then how might we carry it out. We call it marine spatial planning, it really should be called marine spatial management, because planning is a subset of management. And we have to carry out other activities besides planning if we're going to make this a reality. We have to be able to carry out, we have to implement plans, that's important. We don't want to just do plans for their own sake. We want to be able to monitor plans, and we want to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of plans over time. Again, many of the points that John mentioned. So planning is only one part. We need all these other elements of management as well. And this, again, is not unique to the marine environment. We would want to do this if we were doing coastal zone management or watershed management or fisheries management. We would have the same kinds of general activities. But no one had ever put together anything on marine spatial planning, so about 4 or 5 years ago, we obtained considerable funding from the Moore Foundation within UNESCO, or at UNESCO, to develop a guide to marine spatial planning. And in the process of doing that guide over a several-year period, and John Day was one of the advisors to this process, my colleague and I, Fanny Duvray and I, put together a step-by-step kind of approach that I won't go into this kind of detail. In fact, there's even more detail that we could go into, but I don't think you would want to do this at 4:30 in the afternoon. So I'll spare you that and try to show that what we're talking about really is 4 basic questions of what spatial planning is about. And the first one is we want to know where we are today. What's the baseline that we're starting from? Where are we today? This is the baseline characterization. What planning is really about is where do we want to be? Not where we are, but where do we want to be? And what can we do today to move us in the direction of where we want to be? And that involves a series of activities, but perhaps one of the most important is developing alternative scenarios of what the world might look like in 10 years, in 20 years, maybe in 50 years if you're talking about climate change. But this idea of looking at alternatives and designing a management program that moves you in that direction is what planning is all about. How do we get there is the management plan. You just don't develop a management plan, you go through a series of steps about where we are, where we want to be, and where we want to be should be the basis for the management plan. A series of actions, a series of management strategies that actually move you in the direction of where you want to go. And then finally, you want to have targets identified in your planning process so that you can evaluate over time, in 4 years, in 5 years, 10 years, whether or not you're moving in the right direction. What have we accomplished over that period of time by implementing the management measures, and have they been effective, not only from an effectiveness standpoint,